I'm Leah Lane, an award-winning travel writer and author of Places I Remember, Tales, Truths, Delights from 100 Countries. On this podcast, we share conversations with travelers about fascinating destinations and memorable experiences around the world. Wine regions are some of the loveliest areas in the world, climates where grapes thrive, filled with charming towns with farm-to-table food and, of course, great wine. Canadian-born Thatcher Baker Briggs is founder of Thatcher's Wine in LA. He travels the world discovering wine regions and new and excellent varietals. He's just returned from one of his European wine trips and has much to share with us. Welcome, Thatcher, to Places I Remember.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, I know your journey began as a restaurant dishwasher at the age of just 13 and brought you to Michelin star restaurants across the world. Tell us a bit more of your experiences in the culinary scene and how this turned into your deep interest in wine.
I had a passion probably when I was around 9 or 10, and I was obsessed with cooking and ingredients and food. It led me down this path of chasing my dreams to become a chef. And I just happened to get an early start on things and traveled all around Canada and then wanted to work in the Michelin star environment. So I moved to San Francisco and I was at Croix, which was a 2 and 3 Michelin star restaurant. I was cooking and tasting wine and realizing that I don't really know anything about wine. I wanted to really dive in. And so I started studying and I just got hooked, then started pursuing my sommelier exam. I ended up at another 3 Michelin star in San Francisco.
Were you the youngest ever court certified sommelier?
I wasn't the youngest ever. I started at 21, which is the earliest you can do it in the US. And I passed, I think, just after my 22nd birthday.
So recently, you, Thatcher, and your partner, Courtney, combined a relaxing vacation with wine work. So before we talk about some of the regions you explored, let's talk about what you think makes a great wine vacation. I know it depends where you visit, but what do you consider an ideal length of a wine tour, just from a logistical standpoint? How much is too much?
20 days is too much. I will say that. I have an import company. And so we started just about 4 years ago. We've been trying to find the next generation winemakers, a lot of time in Europe in driving. And so we do these longer trips. To be honest, I would never advise anybody doing a solely 20-day wine tour, driving about 2,000 kilometers, because it's quite exhausting. I think that the best amount of time is somewhere around 4 to 5 days. I think you want to get to the wine region, take a day to breathe and just sort of be in the place. And then you can do 4 days of tastings. And then at the end, take another day or two to just relax a little bit. You do consume a lot of wine. And while you might be at home drinking a bottle of wine every night, those afternoon or morning wine tastings do kind of wear on you pretty quickly.
Let me ask you about spitting out the wine versus drinking it. In terms of driving, how do you manage that situation?
If you're driving the same day, you have to be obviously super mindful in spitting. It's nice to do in pairs. So my partner, Courtney, and I will take turns. Sometimes you end up at a winery where you're drinking some of the best wine in the world, and it's a very hard thing to spit.
It's very hard. I agree.
And so that often leads to last minute pivoting and needing to reschedule some tastings. Never book too many tastings in a day because it's impossible to make it on time to all of them. Give yourself a little bit of a buffer because you never know what the winemaker is going to open.
Also, you can take tours. You can take Uber. There are options today where both of you could be drinking, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no Ubers in most of Europe in the wine region. So in the bigger places like Bordeaux, you'll be able to get an Uber. But if you're in Burgundy or a smaller place like Piedmont, there's no Ubers, there's no taxis. There's some drivers that you can book that the hotel can arrange, which is always my piece of advice. But if you're going from Italy to France all within one day, then you're kind of on your own, unfortunately.
Let's talk costs. How do you pay for wine tastings? Are there discounts on wine? Do you need to factor in any other costs that we don't know about?
It depends really on the region. So that's a little tricky to answer. In some of the smaller regions, generally speaking, the tastings are always free. It really just depends on the producer and where you are. If you can do a little bit of research and find a smaller producer, a lot of the times they're more than welcome to just accept your email and invite you in for a tasting. And there's usually no cost associated with it. But it depends. If you're in a larger wine region like Bordeaux, for example, there could be a pretty hefty cost associated with the tasting, somewhere between 100 to a couple €100. And it depends on the winery. Oftentimes, but not always, you'll be able to purchase a case of wine and the price is better than what you would be able to buy the wine for in the US. The one thing, having to carry around a case of
Oh,
wine with
yes.
you is always a little
There's
a little
always
tricky.
something. Well, great wine pairs with great food. How do you plan your eating experiences when you're traveling to wineries? Do you have your main meal at lunch, or how does it work?
We're traveling for work and we're visiting these wineries for business. The most important thing is to find the best restaurants in the regions. Most times we ask the producers, we ask the winemakers, hey, where do you guys go for lunch? Where do you go for dinner? Where do you go for special occasions? And we try to make sure we have a couple of hours in between for lunch and then, of course, for dinner at one of the best regional restaurants. Europe for lunch specifically, there's no such thing as a 30-minute lunch. Every lunch is about 2 hours and has three courses, especially in France.
Sounds good. Sounds like not a big problem.
It's not a bad problem at all.
Right. No. Now, what are typical accommodation options, and what about staying at the vineyards?
So some wineries have their own hotels. Some do not. In Italy, they have the agriturismo, small inn, if you will, and which is always a lovely place to stay. And then you get to spend a little bit more time with the winemaker and build a personal connection. There's always Airbnbs, which are lovely in these smaller regions. And then, of course, there's some really great hotels.
Because everybody loves wine and of all
Exactly.
budget, right?
Exactly.
Makes sense. Okay, there are many beautiful wine regions around the world, many of which we featured on Places I Remember, including South Africa on episode 101, New Zealand on episode 28, Australia, episode 84, Portugal, episode 51, United States, episode 47. So we are aware of the great idea of taking wine trips. But let's talk about the highlights of your recent European wine trip, and I'll add some information too, because I've done a few of these myself. Let's start with France. You recently went to Provence, which accounts for nearly 10% of the world's rosé production. Provence is the one wine region of the world where pink is the main color. How is rosé made compared to red and white wine?
Rosé is really just allowing the skins of red grapes to come into contact with the wine for just a little bit longer. So you can make white wine from red grapes. You can make red wine from red grapes. And that's often just because of how long the skin, the juice itself is actually white. That's the process for rosé. And they've been kind of famous for it. It works super, super well with a lot of their food, grilled fish, squash blossoms,
Oh my
tomatoes,
goodness.
just really like summery things
I can
and
only
rosé, of course.
visualize this, eating squash blossoms and rosé on the coast of France.
It is exactly like that. It's pretty amazing.
Well, you and Courtney spent a week staying at a hotel in Nice, enjoying the sights and the sounds and the amazing food and drink. What are some of your favorite things that you enjoy beyond the vineyards in that area?
I actually went to a tennis academy when I was there. He was the former coach of Serena Williams, and he has this whole tennis resort, Patrick Mortiglu Tennis Academy. It's a really cool facility. The hotel itself is quite nice and the food is delicious, but to be able to go and be athletic for a few days was amazing before a long journey. So if you're a fan of tennis, I highly recommend it. And they do a really great job of putting people together in all different levels. That was one of the highlights.
I love the old town. You just walk around there. There are lovely shops. You could buy the beautiful Provençal prints, placemats still that I use. I love the museums there too. The Chagall Museum, Matisse, and the whole area, the French Riviera, is a gem. We covered that in episode 94. It's lovely to think of that area and wine together. And what could be bad, right? Area of Champagne. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I love Champagne. It's one of my favorite regions. I'm lucky to go to Europe about four times or so a year, and almost every time we do go to Champagne. It's a absolutely massive region. There's two main centers. There's Reims and Epernay, and they're about an hour and a half or so drive apart.
Near Paris, if I may add. They're only
Exactly,
about 150 kilometers east of Paris, so it's a day trip.
exactly. So we often fly into Paris and then we drive up to Champagne. And whether you're coming from New York or California, you tend to land in Paris around anywhere between 7 to 10 a.m. We always fly in the morning and then just go straight to Champagne right after. But it's a huge region. If you go from the top to the bottom, it could be 2, 3 hours of driving. So, but for me, the heart of Champagne is Reims. It's a really beautiful little city, tons of walking. There's really beautiful parks. There's some amazing restaurants. There's also some great restaurants there that are not necessarily French. One of my favorite restaurants is called Restaurant Mala. It's a Chinese noodle restaurant, incredible local organic products, highlighting these Chinese techniques. So you get this really spice, but really high quality product. And it's if you are eating French food for the past week or 2 weeks, and then you go and you eat something a little different, that's always a really great place to
I
visit.
read that you said you can hit McDonald's if you want to get away from it and have champagne with your French fries. That sounded pretty interesting.
I will say Champagne and McDonald's French fries are one of the greatest pleasures in the world. In France, they actually use real potatoes. The quality of McDonald's fries is much higher.
Of course. I like Troy. That's a town in the area. It's very medieval in the old town. It has timber framed houses, Gothic churches, very, very charming. I want to ask about the Champagne houses, the maisons. That's a very special thing in Champagne area that you can stay in these older homes, and many of the vineyards have connections, right?
Yeah, they do for sure. There's two different kind of camps in Champagne in terms of champagne makers. So you have these big maisons like Dom Perignon and Krug. They're the larger houses, and sometimes they have accommodations in which you can stay. And then you have the smaller grower producers, and these are often what I would still kind of consider the farmers of Champagne. They often make champagne, but they own their own vineyards, where Krug doesn't. They own a small percentage of their vineyards. But oftentimes too, some of these smaller producers, they do have just like really small boutique 2-room places. They might just provide breakfast in the morning, and then you get this really beautiful experience of getting to know somebody very intimately.
Sounds delightful. Again, a glass of champagne at night as well. Then you can drink what you want and go to sleep.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's go into Italy. There are 20 wine regions, about 350 official Italian wine varieties, and rumors that there were over 2,000 different Italian grapes throughout the centuries. You went to the Piedmont area in northwest Italy, which is one of the main grape growing areas. It's at the foot of the Western Alps. Tell us a little bit about your visit there. What are the highlights?
Piedmont, I have to say, is probably one of the most beautiful wine regions in the world. Typically, you'll fly into Milan and then drive. It's about anywhere between an hour and 2 hours, kind of depending on traffic getting out of Milan. But it has these rolling hills, and it's so vast, so green in the summertime. It's really a breathtaking place. Hot air balloons flying around. It's really spectacular. There's 5 little villages, if you will, within Piedmont, and it's the sixth being Alba, which is a larger town. But I recommend just driving to a little town like La Mora, which is one of my favorite places. I feel like it's even more medieval. There's all of these really old buildings, small towns. Most of the little towns you can walk around within 25 to 30 minutes. La Mora being a little bit bigger one with more shops, and there's some museums. An absolutely breathtaking place. Don't think I've ever had a bad meal in Piedmont. It's one of my favorite places to eat.
You have to mention truffles, right?
If you can go November, December or the prime time, I always love going around the first week of December for truffles specifically. It's usually towards the endish season of the truffles. You tend to miss a lot of the super crazy busy tourist time, because during truffle season and for the truffle festival, it can be quite hectic and with a lot of people. And during that last week of December, everyone is always gone.
Right. There are lots of tours now where you can go on truffle hunts with the pigs. Alba is a lovely place. Turin is the capital. It's a very vibrant city with art and music and good shopping. There's a royal palace, which is a museum of ancient art. So I think it's a lovely trip.
It really is.
Tell me a little bit about the wine of the region.
It's mostly focused on reds. There are some whites, particularly Arnais. Some producers do a great job, but the reds are really the focus in Piedmont. It's Nebbiolo is the main grape. There's also a little bit of Barbera and Dolcetto. You'll find some early drinking, younger, pleasurable wines. And then you'll also find wines like Barolo need quite a few years of age on it as a minimum aging requirement. You would never really see a bottle in the US unless it's about 5 years old.
I've seen Barolo at many restaurants and it's aged.
Yeah. Amazing with Italian food.
Well, from Italy, you traveled to Baden and Rheinhessen in Germany along the Rhine River. I know you're really excited about this area. It's great for year-round travel, and like some of the other more coastal towns. We featured this area in episode 69 of Places I Remember. Let's see, what kind of wine is the region known for?
Germany is definitely home of Riesling. There's a really big push right now in Germany to have dry wines. I think a lot of times people think of Riesling as the like fruity, sweet wine, but there's a big push to make dry wine. So if you see Riesling on a wine list or anywhere, you can ask if it's dry. And
oh, it's delicious. If it's a good
Oh,
wine.
I love it.
Oh, I love it.
But in Baden, in the southern part, and also a little bit in Rheinhessen, there's been a big focus recently on red wine. Historically, it's been too cold in Germany for the red wines to really ripen. But with global warming, there's been such a significant change. And now it's a big focus. It's getting quite hot. And especially in Baden, which is the hottest place in Germany, it can sometimes get up to 90 degrees. And so Pinot Noir is quickly becoming a focus in both in Baden and Rheinhessen.
Interesting. Of course, you could always take a river cruise along the Rhine and stop. I remember I've taken cruises in the Rhine, on the Rhine and on the Moselle. Both times there were stops to go to the vineyards and sample the wine. So it's a nice way to do it if you don't want to drive. And again, you're taken there, you can drink your wine while you're there at the vineyards. Very beautiful too, just to look out and see all those gorgeous vineyards kind of sloping down to the river. Yes, it's another lovely area in Europe. Spain. Now, there are many famous wine regions, but on your trip, you focused on Valencia, which is overlooking the Mediterranean and has more than 300 days of sunshine a year. So it's a lovely area for weather. Tell us a little bit more about Valencia in terms of wine.
This is a really exciting place for me. It's one of my favorite places in Spain to eat specifically.
And I know what you ate. You ate paella, right? They're
Of course,
known for paella.
You have to eat paella. We flew into Valencia and we spent a little bit of time there, and then we spent a little bit of time in Alicante. It's quite close. It's about an hour and a half drive or so. It's really interesting because in Alicante, in Valencia, they're both famous for their rice, for the paella. They make it differently. In Valencia, you have food that is seafood driven. And then Alicante, which is a bit more inland, you have, well, it's a desert. It's one of the most breathtaking places, but you're basically just looking at rocks the entire time. And so you have food that's more maybe beef or rabbit. The wines from both Alicante and Valencia, some whites, they tend to be more red heavy. And some of the wines can be, because it is quite a hot region, can be very heavy and rich. Where the region is warmer or hotter, the wines always get riper. So there's a higher content of alcohol. But there's a really interesting movement that's happening, particularly in Alicante with some of the younger generation winemakers. They're understanding how to harvest and how to work in the vineyards. And so they're trying to make these much more elegant style wines. We flew from Champagne. We went to Spain just to visit one producer in particular for one day. Well, the winery is called Bodega Saran, and the kids are making a small project from the family winery, and the wines are beautiful. It's really interesting because the whole region is surrounded by these really heavy, dense wines. But they've been spending the last few years working in the vineyards, and the wines are so delicate, so elegant. It's really remarkable. And for me, I love that style because when you're in 110-degree weather, you really don't want to be drinking this 17% alcohol wine. And so I love what they're doing, and I highly recommend a visit.
We're all adapting in our ways, right, to the new climate. This is one of them. I just want to mention Cofrentes, a little village in the Valencia region. It's considered one of the most beautiful, and it has a wonderful castle built in the 12th century. So there's, again, things to do outside of the vineyards in all of these regions we're talking about. And I would say try to leave time, if not every day, at least like you said, a day or two to separate from the wine and to explore because
Definitely.
there is such beauty in this area. Well, the name of the podcast is Places I Remember. So, Thatcher, would you please share a personal travel memory of your wine travels?
4 or 5 years ago, when we were starting this import company, there was one particular producer that I had tasted the wines of and fell in love with. And we were talking for years and years and years. And he had an importer in the US already. So unfortunately, we couldn't work together. Years later, some things changed. And the reason why on this trip we ended up in Alicante was for this producer, as I mentioned. So we got a call from him, and we're in Champagne. We have a flight booked out of Paris. We're supposed to leave. He says, I decided to make a change. And okay, so we're like, all right, we'll be there tomorrow. Turns out I left my wallet at the hotel and we were rushing and didn't know how to get there. And so we had to ship my wallet and then it got missed. And so we kept getting pushed and we ended up somehow driving super fast, made it to the airport in Paris, flew to Spain, went to go see him. And it was this really amazing experience where we were all together. And he says to us, hey, do you want to go eat the best rice in the world? And I said, well, of course.
Sure.
After this crazy travel period and tasting a bunch of wine, we jump in his little car, and it's like a winery car. It's very small. And we're driving down this road, and we're driving for probably an hour and a half into the desert. And we have no idea where we're going. We get to this tiny restaurant in the middle of nowhere and we walk in and he's like, this is the place. And it's this absolutely incredible restaurant. The chef learned from this master of paella, if you will. They cook everything over the vines of grapes, which is really incredible. And they do the traditional Alicante style, which is rabbit and snails, which is a type of paella that I've never heard of before. And we're sitting there and they bring us into the kitchen. And it's this really special thing because they add just the perfect amount of vines of grapes into the fire. And once you add the vines and you add the broth, if you will, to your rice, you can never add more fire and you can never add more liquid. So you basically have this one shot, this one chance. There's no scales, there's no recipes. It's just the feeling of the chef. And so we're sitting there and we're like, wow, we've been traveling for 20 days. We rushed, we drove about 200 kilometers an hour to make it to the airport. Now, all of a sudden, we're sitting here in this kitchen in the middle of nowhere with a winemaker that I've been wanting to spend time with for years and years and years. And then we eat this paella, and it was really one of the greatest foods that I've ever eaten in my life. And so, if you ever find yourself in Alicante, there's a restaurant called Restaurant Elias, Elias. And I highly recommend it. It's worth any journey. As somebody that traveled about 1,000 kilometers for it, it's worth it. That was a really, really special experience for me on the last trip.
A foodie delight. I've written the name down. Someday.
I love
That's
it.
perfect. Right. Well, thank you, Thatcher Baker Briggs, founder of Thatcher's Wine, for sharing the pleasures of eating, drinking, and enjoying some of the loveliest areas of Europe. A toast to you. Chin chin, salud, a votre santé, and cheers to wine and to travel. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to our award-winning podcast. We've recorded over 100 episodes of Places I Remember, so follow us on any podcast app. And new monthly episodes are also on YouTube with gorgeous video. My book, Places I Remember, is available in print and Kindle, and I read the audio version. Follow my travel writing at Forbes.com. Contact me at the links in the show notes or on my website, placesiremember, lealane.com, and keep making your own travel memories.